to deal with the issue, with the problem. And I will do that also in order to take a stand or present my view, my position about the problem in the third part of the talk. And finally, before taking some conclusions, I will argue against indexicalism, which is the theory that I take to be my main opponent. Okay, so I will be saying something about why not to be an indexicalist. So the idea, the debate is about utterances containing evaluative words, evaluative expressions such as apples are tasty. Everybody agrees that there is some kind of context dependence involved in cases like one, and the context sensitivity is probably due to the word tasty. Okay, that involves some kind of perspective or standard of taste, with respect to which that seems to be relevant for assigning a true value to that utterance. Okay, or if I say apples are tasty, sincere, I'm probably saying something true. If Justina says apples are not tasty and she's sincere, probably she's saying also something true. At least we're stating different content. So there is something weird with those utterances, some kind of context sensitivity that has to be explained. Okay? So there are I think two main approaches to the problem. This is a very rough classification, but it will do for the purposes of the talk. And you can be a contextualist, and the moral of contextualism is enrich the content. In a Kaplanian semantic, you have a character which is a function from context to content, and a content which is a function from circumstances of evaluation to truth values. The contextualist says that you have to put the perspective or standard of taste into the content of the utterance. You have a content that involves perspective, and you evaluate that content with respect to a time and maybe a word and maybe a time in order to get a truth value. Okay. So the idea is when I say apples are tasty, I'm saying apples are tasty to me or to some relevant perspective in the context of utterance. I think there are two main ways of being a contextualist. I will present and explain them, but I will propose a different kind of contextualism. The two ways are indexicalism, which is indexicalists claim that there is a covered variable in logical form, which is not phonetically realized, that requires a perspective from the context provision of a perspective. Okay, and so there is a variable logical form which is for perspective and it's saturated with the context. In different contexts, you may have different values, of course, like in Mexico. The other view is you may appeal to an articulated constituent. An articulated constituent is an element that is part of the content of the utterance, of the proposition expressed by the utterance, but it's not linguistically represented in any way. Okay, so there's nothing in the sentence that corresponds to that element of the truth conditions of the utterance. So there is no covered variable in logical form in that case. In both cases, nevertheless, you have a richer content that it appears to be. The other, broadly speaking, the other strategy is relativism, which is the idea of enriching the circumstances of evaluation. That is, you have a constant content across different contexts of utterance, but that content is evaluated for truth values not only with respect to words and times, but also with respect to standard of taste. Okay, so the content is constant, but the truth value may vary according to context. And you have two main ways of being a relativist. You can be a moderate relativist or a radical relativist. I think the main difference between those kind of those two forms of relativism is that the moderate relativist believes that the standard of taste, the parameter corresponding to the standard of taste in the circumstances of evaluation, is fixed by the context of utterance, while the radical relativist believes that it's the context of assessment, a new kind of context, which fixes the non-standard parameter in the circumstances of evaluation. So, as I advanced before, I'm a contextualist. So I think that you have to enrich the content. That is, the perspective, at least sometimes, gets into the content of the audience. It gives you something richer than it looks like in the first place. So, I'm a contextualist, but I will not defend lexicalism. So I don't claim that there is a covered variable in logical form. It's not a hidden lexical that requires the provision, contextual provision of a perspective. And I will not defend that there are some articulated constituents in the utterance either. So what I think about this problem, I think that utterances containing evaluative predicates as tasty are context sensitive in the sense that they can write their content with context. That is what makes me a contextualist, I think, in my definition, my classification. But the change is due to an optional process of modulation of the semantic content of the expression, of the evaluative expression, the word tasty in this case. So, no covered variable, no unarticulated constituent. The process involved is modulation. The idea is that the semantic content of an expression can be more or less specific in context in order to make sense of an utterance. Okay? What I mean with semantic content is the contribution of an expression to the truth conditions of the utterance. Okay? So that the contribution of an expression to the truth conditions of the utterance can be adjusted, modified, modulated in order to make sense of an utterance. So, for those who are not familiar with the notion of modulation, the idea is a process of free enrichment by which the semantic content of an expression is adjusted. And the main characteristic of modulation is that it's optional. Okay, as he has shown in different works. The idea of optionality is that a sentence containing that expression can express a complete proposition, a full proposition, without being enriched, without being modulated. I don't need a modulation in order to be able to assign a truth value to the sentence. So, at least in some context, I can express apple tasting and express a full proposition, something that can be evaluated with respect to the world and give truth value without modulating the word. So if you have a covered variable in logical form, you always need something from the context in order to get a full proposition. You have an empty slot in logical form that requires the provision, contextual provision of a perspective. The other characteristic is that, broadly speaking, it's possible that modulation is driven by principles of relevance, in the sense that an utterance generates an expectation of relevance in the hearer, and the hearer adjusts the semantic content of some or one expression in order to satisfy those expectations of relevance, okay, in order to make sense of the utterance. That's the idea. And I want to point out that this is different from an unarticulated constituent. Remember that the idea of an unarticulated constituent is the idea of an element of content that is not linguistically represented. But the modified or modulated semantic content of an expression has something that corresponds to it in a sentence. That is the word that is the input of the process of modulation. So, in some sense, it's not unarticulated. There is something in the sentence that corresponds to that content, that modulated content. So the idea is that an utterance like one, apples are tasty. In those cases, at least sometimes the monadic predicate is made more specific. Tasty to me, tasty to one, tasty so on, according to the context of utterance, of course, in order to satisfy expectations of relevance generated in here by the utterance. That is a process, optional process of re-enrichment that modifies the content of the utterance and allows us to explain the possible difference in truth value to different contexts. Okay? Now, why not to be an indexicalist? One could say that the contextual provision of the perspective is required in every context of utterance. You always need, in order to get a true value, a perspective. Perspective. It makes no sense to say that apples are tasty expresses a full proposition without the contextual provision of a perspective. Okay? Someone could say that, an indexicalist, to be sure, would say that. So if you need in any context, in every context you need the perspective, then probably the language is linguistically required. The language requires the provision of the perspective, so that suggests that there is a covered variable in the logical form of the utterance. So I will try to show that that is not the case. I will apply or make use of a kind of test provided by Recanati in this work. I will talk about a kind of test for optionality that found that applies the criterion of optionality. The idea is this. An over-pronominal element, when not explicitly bound, always receives a specific value. For example, he's a teacher cannot be read as someone is a teacher. He, the variable, the pronominal element, cannot be read indefinitely, okay? As existentially bound. And the same should happen with implicit arguments, okay? It shouldn't be possible to get indefinite reading when not explicitly bound. For example, example, it is raining, shouldn't be possible to read for it, it's raining as in 5, it's raining somewhere, okay? If for contains a covered variable or in place, it shouldn't be possible to read for as 5, okay? In any context of utterance, in every context of utterance, the hidden variable should receive a specific value, a specific place in this case, okay? So there's no context of utterance when you could read indefinitely the utterance it's raining. So whether or not the examples for it's raining for weather reports are compelling, I think the test is okay, and you can run the test for evaluative predicates. Okay? So you can ask yourself if there is some context where you can use tasty and read that word naturally as an indefinite way, okay, like as tasty for someone. If you can do that, you have a context where the sentence alone, without modulating the word tasty, expresses a full proposition, and that is, suggests that you don't have a covered by the logical form. So I think one possible example is this. Suppose one bakes a cake and he puts it in the fridge to get to it later when back from work, and when he gets back home, the cake is not there anymore and there is clear signs that someone ate the cake. So he says it seems that the cake was tasty. And I think the most natural reading is the cake was tasty for someone, as he doesn't know who ate the cake or in what circumstances the cake was eaten. So I think it's natural to read 6 in indefinite way. Okay, like the cake was tasty for some. And that indicates that you don't need the contextual provision of a specific perspective in every context. So that suggests, according to the test, that there is no covered variable. The other way of seeing whether there is a covered variable or not is see if you can construct a dialogue like this. anything you can, and it's more or less natural. Sean says it seems that the cake was tasty, involved, asked for whom, and the reply is, I don't know, I have no idea. I don't see, I think you can construct this kind of dialogue without an easy intuitive. Okay, it's not hard to read, hard to imagine a dialogue like the one stage in 7. So my idea is there is another way of being a contextualist. That is another way of explaining the context sensitivity of the predicates between the execution and an articulated constituency, which is appealing to modulation. And you can argue that there is no covered variable in logical form. Running the test of optionality. Okay? So the conclusion is that good trances involving evaluative predicates as tasty may vary with the content of the context. That is what makes me a contextualist. According to my classification, that is what explains the possible difference in truth value, the one I stated at the beginning of the talk. That variation is due to modulation of the predicate expressed by the word tasty. And the enrichment is optional in the sense that there is no implicit argument in tasty that calls for saturation, that needs, that requires to be filled in the context of ultrans. Thanks.
So I don't know whether there is a moderator here. Okay, so I'll be the moderator. Yes, questions? Yeah.
You're talking about evaluative, like tasting stuff. So do you cover all evaluative terms or only a certain group?
Usually this discussion is focused on soft evaluative predicates like tasty, funny, but you can expand the discussion to more evaluative terms.
Because I'm not too sure with moral terms. And in morality you have these thick terms like courageous, and it seems to work. But what about sin terms like good and bad? They are evaluative, but they're not. If I say killing children or what you did is bad, it's not bad for me, but bad for you, it's bad, full stop. Okay, so it doesn't work.
There are different areas of the discourse, and probably you need you have a different behavior of evaluative terms in those different areas. So clearly, I think at least that in moral discourse you have an objective way of saying something's good or something's bad. Not according to the context of something like that. But anyway, this kind of semantic approach is not can explain away those cases, because you have a relativity to the context, but in the context the sentence or the ultrans expresses an absolute truth or falsity.
It's actually not only the sick ones too. It's not only good and bad, but it's like courageous. It's not relative to reason. So you have a small area of courageous. Courageous. Right.
Okay.
Yeah. So the whole area of morality doesn't be covered by that.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I am not saying that this approach can easily expand to any evaluative term. It's usually, I'm talking more of soft evaluative predicates, like funny, tasty, that horrible, disgusting, those kinds of predicates. But there are, as you say, another evaluative terms, like hard evaluative terms, like bad or good. And maybe you have to.
Even what's funny if you think about it, if I say jokes about the Holocaust are not funny, it's not context dependent.
Yeah, but that is a tricky question, because you're super overlapping moral issue.
Oh, so well, okay.
If you say roller coasters are funny, it's not.
Yeah, so it's not really clear to what exactly your analysis applies. In many cases and contexts which doesn't work.
evaluative terms, and I'm focusing on soft evaluative terms. You're focusing on a use of, an soft evaluative term like funny, but where there is a moral issue behind. So that is kind of context which is not the kind of context I'm having in mind. I mean the usual use of an evaluative term like funny. In that case, it's not clear where there is only a perspective, a standard of funny, but also a moral standard when you make a joke about the other house.
Yes, Professor Recanati.
Yes. So first a remark, you said rightly that there is a difference between unarticulated constituents and modulation, because in the case of modulation, whatever is potentially provided is an aspect of the semantic value of a particular expression, namely the word whose meaning is modulated. So there is this difference between two views that are similar in many ways, but there is this difference. And I think the same is true for the indexicalist. There are two ways to be indexicalist. You mentioned only one. You said that for the indexicalist there is a free variable that's not usually realized, that's not, you can hear it, but it's there somehow in the syntax. But there is another possibility for an indexicalist. The indexicalist can say that the predicate itself, say, funny, tasty, is an indexical, and its content depends upon the context. So in this case, there would be an indexical in logical form, but the indexical would be actually realized because it's the word tasty itself that might be treated as an indexical. That's the view taken by Rothschild and Siegel, and it's also a form of contextualism that would be on the indexicalist side. So and it's a sort of parallel to the extension again. But anyway, okay, so let's go to the heart of your. It would be great if that were the way you would describe things. I mean, I would be all in favor of it, but I'm not convinced by the example. The problem is that modulation indeed is optional. Therefore, if you say that when you use tasty in the sense that tasty for me or for you, that's a matter of modulation or enrichment, that means that there is a sort of literal sense that's not relative to anybody. That's just plain, bare, tasty, for no one in particular. And actually that's what you said about the moral terms. You said that's true, that's funny in certain contexts. If that were right, that would actually support him. Because in order for something to be modulation, there's got to be something that's unmodulated, the plain sense. There's got to be a possible reading for the use of the word funny. Now it's very difficult to find a sentence like this is tasty or this is funny. That means tasty for no one in particular. And the only sense I can make of this is by having something generic, like tasty for everybody or for the normal person. That might be what comes closest to a bare sense. Now the example you gave, it seems that the cake was tasty. Seems to me, you're right that it's possible to paraphrase this by it was tasty for someone, but here the someone would be specific and definite. That is, you have someone in mind. Actually, it's not anybody. It's the guy who ate the cake or something like this. So it doesn't strike me that this is really a bare sense, tasty for nobody in particular. And the problem, if you consider that the bare reading would be the generic reading. Tasty in general, tasty for people in general, or whoever eats it. So is that? I think that would be a way of actually accepting something like a form of relativism. That would mean that there is actually a relativity that's built in the meaning of that predicate. It's got to be relative to someone. There's got to be a judge. The judge may be the normal person or everybody. That would be the generic case, and that can be someone more specific. So you would accept something like a form of relativism, I suppose, or one of the theories that you want to reject. You would have to accept that for the plain reading. But then you could still argue that when you use tasty in a sense, that tasty for me or tasty for Justina or whoever, you might still argue that this is a matter of modulation. Going from the sort of what would be the base sense or the bare sense to this more specific sense might be treated as a case of modulation, something optional. But still, in order to have an account like the one you described, that would be really sort of sort of contextualist account, but that only treats the cases in which, that treats through modulation the cases in which there is relativization to someone, to some particular point of view. That view presupposes that there is a sort of basic sense that's totally unrelativized. And it's very hard to make sense of that. It's hard to think of tastiness that is not relative to someone's taste. That's hard to see.
Well, I agree that it depends, my view depends on whether you can make sense of an objective use of tasting, something like that. Like, with tasting, you use it in an objective way.
And you have to find examples in which that sense is the sense.
Okay, but when you say that an example that didn't convince you because it seems that the speaker has something in mind, which is the one-way decay, the perspective of. I don't think that the one-way decay is a specific perspective. I think that is precisely tasty for someone. Of course, the most natural reading is the one-way decay because someone didn't make the cake, he cannot know whether it's tasty or not. But I think that is the way of saying that is tasty for someone. It's not a specific perspective. It's hard to me to read the one who ate the cake like specific perspective. It's just saying whoever the cake is tasty for that one. There is someone who ate the cake and the cake is tasty for that person. I think that is the definite reading.
It's not really indefinite. Referring to that person, even if you don't know who the person is.
But it's existentially bound to say there's an X ate the cake, and the cake is tasty for X, something like that. And that's how I read the example.
I know.
I think that that's the most natural reading. But of course, it depends on whether you find this is about intuitions. So maybe you do not share my intuitions about that example. Maybe I have to find an example that convinces me. Regarding the other part, you say that maybe I'm talking about the generic reading of tasty, and that makes me kind of relativist. That's what you say.
Yeah, I wasn't too sure, but yeah.
I don't find relativism appealing regarding evaluative terms like this because I think that at least sometimes you have the intention of making some perspective salient. You make a nutrient and you intend that the other recognizes that you are assuming a particular perspective. So if you have those kinds of intentions, I think that it's more natural to do the perspective in those cases at least as part of the content, as the intended content of the nutrients. So I don't think that I don't find relativism appealing at all in this kind of cases, at least.
Oh, I wasn't. Maybe we haven't enough time.
No, yes, that's
Yeah, no, yeah,
okay.
of course.
That's thank you, Nicolas.
Okay.
Discussed now is the possibility of maintaining a position which is describing with what Nicola called a non-contextualist, non-indexical contextualism or a moderate relativism. So a moderate, yeah. And I'm going to try to provide an answer to these questions. So can we explain faultless disagreements, or should we explain faultless disagreements? And the answer is going to be in both cases yes, we can, and yes, we should. What I want to say is that if we want to explain moderate faultless disagreements, the way to go is not going to be via moderate sure that most of us are aware of what happens when we have sentences like this one. The first one, they are called like, they are supposed to have an absolute truth. That means that when we try to determine if something like this tree is an ant is true or not, we only take into account the word. But when we try to determine whether vanilla ice cream is delicious, we have to take into account the word, but also some kind of extra parameter, or the value we give to an extra parameter as sui generis parameter. In the case of the toy examples with which we work in this kind of area, is usually a taste parameter or something like that. So if under my taste parameter vanilla ice cream is in fact delicious, then the sentence is going to be true, and otherwise it's going to be false. Now these kind of sentences give rise to what has been called faultless disagreement. When we are disagreeing about whether an elm is, whether certain tree is an elm or not, one of us is going to be mistaken, because the tree in fact is going to be either an elm or another kind of tree. But when we disagree about things like the taste or the deliciousness of ice cream taste, we are going to be disagreeing even though we are going to be all assessing true things. Because for me, claiming that ice cream, vanilla ice cream is delicious is true, because for me, under my value of the taste parameter, that is true, but maybe for one of you, that is false. So if you deny that it is delicious, then you're going to be asserting something which is true, right? So that is basically what happens when we have faultless disagreement. Now, why for Recanati for you this is a problem? Recanati wants to say that disagreements are always over the complete content and not over what is called the electron. Usually we think about the complete content as an Austinian position, and we think about the electron as some kind of function from circumstances of evaluation to truth values. So, because independent reasons, he wants to claim that disagreement can only be about the complete content. In order to sustain this thing, he makes two moves. The first one is to present a criticism to those who think that disagreements are over the electron, which are not only radical relativists, but also a soft version of moderate relativists. So what is the critic he does? He's claiming that in order to say that we are disagreeing over the electron, the two contenders or the two speakers must have or must provide different values to the sui generis parameter. That is, they are claiming or they are asserting something which could be translated as vanilla ice cream is delicious for me, right? But then if we have one electron and two people with different values in that sui generis parameter, what we really have is not a faultless disagreement, but a misunderstanding. The same misunderstanding that happens when, for example, I say that for me the computer is to my left, and for you the computer is to the right of what you see. We have different perspectives, and we may be disagreeing if I say the computer is to the left, or the computer is on the left of, I don't know, the table, and you say no, it's on the right, or something like that. But that's because we are mistaking about the perspective from which we are assessing something like that. Then in those cases, we are not really dealing with faultless disagreement, but with misunderstandings. Now, if we had complete content, if disagreement were over complete content, then necessarily we would have to have the same value for the sui generis parameter, right? We would have the electron, but also a parameter which would be shared by both speakers, both interlocutors. But then we wouldn't have either faultless disagreement. We would have faulty disagreements, because necessarily one of us would be applying or misapplying the shared parameter in a wrong way, right? So for example, I can say, suppose there is a objective standard for which Brazilian state makes the best cachaça. And then the best cachaça is made in the state of Ceará or something like that. And I say, that's not part of and I say that the best cachaça is made in, I don't know, Santa Catarina, and someone corrects me and says, no, it's made in Sierra, and that's because I'm misapplying the objective standard. I'm committing a fault. So far, what the Recanat is doing is making disappear the problem of faultless disagreement, because apparently so far there is nothing like a faultless disagreement. But he accepts that there is one case which is kind of strange or rare, but it's only this case where we can accept that there is faultless disagreement, and it's a case in which even when we share the same value given to a certain parameter, the way in which we appeal to that value is progressive. We are constructing the value of the parameter. And in that construction, in that dealing with deciding which one is going to be our shared parameter, we can disagree between one another, and we are committing a genuine faultless disagreement. For that case, he admits that faultless disagreements can exist, but he claims that the only way to explain this faultless disagreement is by claiming that the disagreement is about the complete content. Basically, that is Recanet's position on the issue, and what is interesting for me is that he distinguishes two kinds of moderate relativism. A soft individualistic one, which disagrees about the electron, and a more strong moderate relativism, which disagrees about the complete content, but has a communal value to the sui generis parameter. So, why would I say that why would I say that moderate relativism cannot explain? I can go on without. Wait. Why would I say that moderate relativism cannot account for faultless disagreement? I accept that when we deal with cases of apparent faultless disagreement, most of the time we're dealing with misunderstanding and with cases of faulty disagreements. But I understand that there is a small portion of this kind of discussions that are what we could be calling genuine faultless disagreements. And even though part of these genuinely faultless disagreements are what Recanati says, I mean, cases in which we are constructing our shared parameter, actually there is another portion which is cases in which the participants are not sharing the parameter and are aware that they are not sharing the parameter. In order to see or to understand what I have in mind, we should switch our mentality from thinking of these toy examples with taste predicates like ice cream stage and all these, and start thinking on more serious issues like, for example, politics. If we have two political parties discussing, and they are discussing because they want to agree on a certain action plan or something like that, suppose they are discussing whether or not it's convenient to raise taxes, and they are discussing from different perspectives, from different political values, for example, they know that the other person is not sharing their political values, and the discussion is not oriented to convince the other to come to accept our political values, but just coordinating on whether to raise the taxes or not. So if we have these kind of examples in mind, we have that in those cases we are disagreeing, but we are not sharing the parameter, and our goal is not to go to a shared value to the political value parameter or something like that, but just coordinate about what to do immediately regarding some plan of action. And they are not cases of misunderstanding. We know that the other person is not sharing our parameters. So these cases raise a certain behavior. And I think that maybe this is an assumption I'm taking, but I think that any theory who wants to explain what happens with the correctness of assertions should explain what speakers behave when they use this kind of expressions. They should be explaining what happens in linguistic practice. So what happens in this kind of discussion? What happens is that basically each speaker thinks that he's right, and each speaker thinks that the other one is wrong, even though he knows and he is completely aware of the fact that under the lights of the other speaker is correct, right? So what we are doing in those cases is assessing what the other said under our own lights, even when we know that under their own lights they are correct. That's what should be explained when we are playing this game of explaining what happened in the thoughtless disagreement. So that means that when we are this is not my computer. What we are doing when we are playing this game of thoughtlessly disagree with someone is to assess sentences or assess assertions. So we can follow this norm, right? The assertion of one sentence S is considered correct in a content C, only if the content of that sentence S in C is true in the word of C, and under the value given to a parameter P, certain parameter relevant to the case, right? But the fact is that this is misleading because it makes us think that we only have one norm. And what we are doing when we discuss these kind of things is making two different things. We are assessing what we say because we want to assessing what we assert because we want to assert correct things, but we are also assessing what the other one says because we want to detect when the other is correct and when it's not correct. So we have two norms. In the first case, when we are assessing my own assessment, we are assessing them under the value I give to the parameter P. So I'm going to assess what is correct for me, right? But when we are assessing what the other one says, what I'm going to do in this kind of discussions is to assess what the other one says, not under the parameter or the value he gives to the parameter, but under the value I give to the parameter. In those kind of discussions, I'm going to consider that you are mistaken if you're saying something that is not correct under my parameters, even though I am aware that under your parameters, what you say is correct. So we have two different kinds of norms governing two different kinds of behavior within the practice of thoughtlessly disagreeing. Now, I think that moderate relativism and radical relativism both are two theories that are focused in each of these dimensions. Now, moderate relativism is focused on explaining why there is a thoughtless disagreement. So for that, they have to explain that each of the contenders is right or is asserting correct sentences or something like that. But radical relativism, on the other hand, is more focused on explaining why we have disagreement. And for that, it needs to focus on the fact that we use only one standard mind to assess the rest of the things, both what I am saying and what you are saying. So what I say is that if we want to explain what happens, I mean the linguistic behavior of people involved in this kind of discussions, we have to provide a way to explain why people think that they are correct, even though why they are correct and the other is mistaken, even though they are aware that the other one is not mistaken under their own lights. And I think that only radical relativism can do that because it's the only theory that allows that value given to parameter P to be different from that of the speaker. When the case with moderate relativism is that moderate relativism fixes the value of that parameter to the speaker in each case, and for that reason it cannot explain why, for me, knowing that under your parameter, under the value you give to the parameter P, what you say is true, for me you are committing a mistake. mistake or you are wrong, and that's that I'm going to discuss what you're saying. And this has bad news because for people that want to be moderate relativism or contextualism, that means that only radical relativism can explain this kind of phenomenon, and also that disagreement then would be over the lecton and not over the complete content, which is something that may be unfortunate for people like Reganati, who has independent reasons for wanting disagreement to be over the complete content. So that would be basically all. Thanks.
So we open questions. Yes.
So why do you need to, once you have the sort of a radical relativist picture with context of assessments in addition to the context of utterance, why do you need these two? You said there are two aspects to the evaluation with respect to oneself and evaluation with respect to the other person. Why not say that in both cases it's the assessor's point of view that's used to evaluate? So when I evaluate my own case and what I've just said, of course, my point of view as speaker and my point of view as assessor, that's the same thing, because the speaker is the assessor when I look at when I look at what the other is saying, I'm not considering his point of view as speaker. That doesn't matter. What matters is my point of view as assessor, and I use my values to evaluate what he says and then judge that it's false. So you don't really need to have this sort of double standard of evaluation. As soon as you appeal to the context of assessment, you can say that this is the rule, basically. We use the context of assessment and the parameters, the parameters fixed by the context of assessment.
I thought that separating or establishing a difference between these two norms would be would be a way to put in an easier way what happens when we are dealing with these discussions. I assess what I'm saying with my standards and what you are saying also with my standards.
Yeah.
But then, yeah, I could do a reconstruction of that, just saying that the assessor's standard is the only one that matters. In both cases, I would be a relativist, a radical relativist. So, but I think that it's more clear if I put it in the other way to show what is going to be, what needs explication or some kind of explanation. What happens when we discuss is that I am going to be assessing my things and your things under my own standard, but not under yours, at least in some cases of this disagreement.
Any other question? Go ahead.
Do you think there's how can you make place for your position for exocentric standards? Like these examples, like Glasgow's examples, when your mother says roller coasters are funny, he means for his child or something like that. He's using standard for to make the assertion, but not his own standard, but standard. Do you think that is a good example?
I don't know if that's a good example of what I was trying to explain. I think it can be explained like in some cases we appeal to the standard of the speaker instead of our standard. I don't know if that's a case of all this disagreement or the kind of cases that maybe are interesting of discussing.
Well, then, thank you. The main issue will be how would a intersectionality and second account of assertion would go. The main motivation is that I'm both an advocate of the relation of relativism and part-time relationists, so I have an interest in knowing how far can we go in making these two views compatible. So I start by saying saying something about what deflationism and radical relativism are, very briefly. And then I'm going to zoom in on which are the problematic features of truth relativistic assertions, which also have been used in order to argue against the coherence of truth relativism. In particular, how are we to formulate norms of assertion that of truth, once truth is counted as relative, and how may we ground a rational practice of assertion upon relative truth. So, very briefly, deflationism is the idea that truth is not a very interesting property. In particular, it cannot play any interesting role in philosophical accounts. And hence, a problem for understanding assertions in terms of truth, apparently. And the idea of relativism, or radical relativism, which I will be stating as follows, that the correctness conditions of certain utterances are assessment sensitive. We've already seen examples of truth relativism consists in radical truth relativism, I should say. In the case of tasting, for example, it's just all the idea that whether a sentence like apples are tasty is true depends on the perspective from which it's been assessed. So if Nicola were to utter that apples are tasty, he could very well be saying something true according to his perspective, but false according to mine. So it seems that whether his utterance, his assertions that apples are tasty depends ultimately upon the point of view from which it's been assessed. Now, these features of this very little language game, this like tasty, seem to generate two concerns. The first one, more theoretical, more driven by considerations of deflationism, is how to understand the norms and how to formulate the norms of assertion within relativistic domains. Because it seems that in order to say what assertion is, you have to provide norms that guide practice, such as you have to assert only what's true. Hence, true or truth seems to be an ineliminable feature of an account of norms of assertion. Secondly, and more importantly, also more generally, assertion when truth is relative, to wit, assertion when utterance correctness conditions are unstable, doesn't seem to be, or it has been argued not to be a coherent practice at all. Since if the correctness of certain utterances is assessment sensitive, then it seems that the speaker cannot comply with the injunction of asserting mostly correct things, because the correctness of her assertion will be utterly out of her control. So, a usual way of formulating the truth norm of assertion is something like what is stated in IMAG. It's just the injunction of asserting only what is true. There's another way of capturing that injunction, this will be relevant later, which is from a sort of an external perspective, which is asking Tena in the second one. That says, from a third person perspective, that a speaker ought to assert only what's true. Now, trivial as they are, these formulations are problematic once we start to countenance relativism of the truth predicate. The main reason is that when we formulate an external norm and we describe that injunction from the third person perspective, have to appeal to truth predicate that is not obviously intelligible, such as a sentence being true relative to perspective or something like that. So, part of the challenge of making truth relativism compatible with inflationism is to get a grasp on what true given a perspective could be. I want to suggest that it should be understood or fleshed out in terms of a more general notion of acceptability relative to a standard. So the injunction would be that an agent ought to assert X only if X is acceptable relative to his standard. Now, this in abstract says nothing. So basically the idea would be that an agent ought to assert, for example, that apples are tasty only if he is occupies a perspective or has a standard according to which apples are indeed tasty. The more interesting cases are cases of stronger evaluative predicates such as moral or epistemic justification. Just to be ahead of a possible question, this is designed indeed to apply to those predicates, but I will concentrate on the discussion of tasting because I don't know exactly how to resolve all the issues for stronger predicates. So the idea is that more generally, the injunction is to assert what is assertable given your own normative commitments, be it in the form of taste standard, which is a very relaxed normative commitment, or given your endorsement of a certain epistemic policy in the case of justification for beliefs, or your endorsement of a moral policy in the case of evaluative moral practice. So the content of the idea of truth relative to a perspective would be indeed acceptability or assertability relative to a normative standard or normative policy. Now, it seems that if we countenance the idea that certain utterances have unstable correctness conditions, then we have a problem in making sense of assertion in the following sense. It has been argued, and in particular Gareth Evans has argued, Garcia Carpintero has argued, that once you have unstable correctness conditions, truth or correctness cannot be a guide for assertion. In the sense that if you want to aim at truth, you can aim at what is true relative to your own perspective, but you know that your perspective is one among many, so what actually is true according to yours can justifiably be taken to be false according to the assessors. So, how can you decide what to assert if what you are going to say is going to be assessed as incorrect, regardless of whether you deem it to be true? And more radically, sorry, it's very sensitive. More radically, the idea is that if you have unstable correctness conditions and you manage somehow to assert according to them, then the practice that is generated by countenancing unstable correctness conditions is not a rational one. The model here is the idea of the internal idea is the following. Suppose indeed utterances do have unstable correctness conditions, and take an utterance such as, for example, it's raining. the idea is, if assertion does indeed have unstable conditions, I'm perfectly entitled to take Nicola's utterance of it is raining and assess it from wherever I am, hence leaving false if it's raining, if it is not raining where I am, regardless of whether it is raining or not, where Nicola is. And you pretty much see how this cannot be a rational practice, because we wouldn't be able to convey any information whatever. So, it has been argued that if you countenance assessment sensitive correct conditions, you get this kind of incoherence concerning assertion. So, what to do? In order to counter the first problem, namely that truth cannot be a name of assertion if it is relative truth, because you won't be able to just a second. In order to counter the first problem, that truth cannot be an assertion, I think the answer is pretty trivial. Actually, it can. The injunction of the speaker is just to assert what is true given her perspective, nothing else. So she has no problem in interpreting others, no problem in deciding what to assert. She just complies with the injunction of asserting what is true given her perspective. No problem there. The problem is with making sense of the practice that follows from this, because we got remind the idea is that once you accept the different truth, whether the speaker is or not correct is not up to the speaker, but up to the assessor. So we have to explain the dynamics of this practice to show that it is rational and coherent practice. So the key idea here is that we have two different sets of norms. One set of norms for assertion, which are Ina and Rena here, and a set of norms for evaluation, which entitle the assessor to assess according to her own standard and not according to the speakers. So it is here we have a practice that consists in the following. I assert a sentence that is true relative to my standard, then Nicola interprets that utterance as true according to my standard, but assesses the correctness relative to his. So this is the dynamics of the practice of relativistic assertion. How much time do you have?
6 minutes.
But now, as I said, it has been argued that this model of assertion just makes all assertion incoherent. And actually it doesn't because of the locality concern. All these arguments that rely on the ideal correct conditions and stable correct conditions makes for incoherent assertion rely on the idea that truth relativism is supposed to be a global notion, a global thesis, that the instability of correct conditions affects indeed sentences like it is raining or whether Socrates is sitting or not. But actually there is no need and prima facie no reason to adopt a global thesis of relativism. We can have, and I think we do have, two models of the practice of making and evaluating assertions. One model, which applies to objective sentences, like it is raining, is a model which does not appeal to these norms of evaluation. It's a model in which you have to evaluate utterances relative to the actor's perspective. So, in the case of brain, it's part of the practice we have with those kind of sentences to evaluate them with respect to the context of utterance. Whereas for the case of tasty or moral predicates generally, the practice is a different one. The practice is to evaluate assertions with respect to our own perspectives. That we don't have to honor in that sense the speakers. So this is the deal of locality. We have two different practices of assertion, and the one governed by these norms is just one limited practice of assertion we have within limited domains. Domains that do not purport to be purely informative ones. So, the last issue in making truth relativistic assertion rational practice to have is to say what is in these domains to which it applies that makes those domains special. Well, why they are useful domains, this is a useful practice within those domains. I have worked out a solution for the case of soft predicates like tasty. The utility, the usefulness of having this practice within non-objective domains such as taste sentences is to be able to, as Justina said, or more general and more interesting domains, to be able to coordinate perspectives and action. So, in part of what we would call in the Wittgensteinian rule the Filosofia grammars of tasting is to be an expression kind of in between a purely subjective use like apples are tasty for me and a purely objective use such as apples are sweet. We do have a use for apples are tasty that achieves what is not achieved by none of the latter. In particular, apples are tasty has a sort of performative flavor to it. We are not merely conveying information that I like apples, which I could do by simply uttering apples are tasty for me. We are not stating an objective property of apples, but we are kind of endorsing, for example, the idea that we should order apples or order cake or something like that. So what we achieve is actually to convey information about the world, but also to promote, in a sense, certain values.
We have some more minutes for questions.
How do you connect the performativity and the relativism to the relativistic part? Couldn't you simply add performativity? How exactly do they connect?
How, in what sense of connecting? I mean, you think that if you have performativity, that you don't need relativity?
Well, I don't have no definite views, but I'd like to see more precisely how the two things are articulated in your framework.
Well, in the full sense, relativism, I take it to be a thesis about how do we assess the correctness of utterances. So it's, in a sense, fact, how we behave concerning utterances of sentences like apples are tasty, or this is good or bad. We are justified in doing this or that. That we behave in that way. We behave in a relativistic way. We assess those utterances according to our own standards. So that seems to be just a feature of how we actually make an evaluated assertion or moves in that
the retraction data that you didn't mentioned the retraction data and so on to support this view that there is this relativistic practice.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
now, and performativity now.
The performative dimension, I think, it is brought out by reflection on why we have these kind of practices. Actually, it is sort of a performative dimension that, in a sense, every assertion may be seen to have in the following sense. Every time you assert something, there is a performative, there's an act you make, performative action you make, such as endorsing the truth of the point or something like that. In the case of informative uses of language, such as it is raining, it is sort of trivial performative dimension. You are just endorsing a certain piece of information. In this case, the assertoric force is not just conveying a commitment to the truth of a certain piece of information, because you don't have an objective piece of information to evaluate. What you do have is a certain information you convey, which is, for example, that you find out is tasty, and an endorsement of the perspective from which that assertion is being made. You achieve two things. You assert a content, thereby conveying some information about you, and you do something with the perspective which is not part of the content, but which is involved in a sense in the force of the assertion. And what you do with that is to well, here you could say two things. You are, in a sense, conveying that you have a certain perspective, a certain standard going to reach that utterance a certain. And then you are, by defending the claim that apples are tasty, or by defending the claim that believing such and such is justified, you are endorsing the perspective from which you are making the assertion. You are endorsing the validity of the usefulness of a certain standard, a certain policy. And you are, in a sense, telling others that they should endorse it also. That was the performative dimension.
And by so doing, you are trying to enforce a certain stability despite the acknowledgement of the instability of the point of view of the assessor. You're trying to establish some common value or something like that.
Some common value?
Some common value or point of view. Or
Yes, at least in the limited case. This is perhaps explained by what Justina said in the case of political debate. You are trying to enforce consensus on a certain particular matter, but not necessarily you are trying to convince the other that they should accept your own perspective, but you are endorsing it as a perspective that is to be taken into account in order to achieve consensus for action or something like that.
Just a quick question, it might just show that I misunderstood you. But earlier you said you wanted to present a deflationary account of truth, right? And then you expressed it in terms of acceptability to standard.
Yeah.
And is it really deflationary? Then you have to ask, what does acceptability, what does the standard mean? And you might have to come back to the notion of truth again, so it's not really deflationary.
Yeah. Well, I haven't really shown it to be deflationary, that's true. inflationary understanding of acceptability. Well, it would have to be a count of acceptability that does not rely on truth, on any substantive role. I mean, you can have a really generalizing role, but not a substantial one. So, indeed, I have to provide an account of what acceptability consists in that does not rely on any substantive use of truth. The thing is, I think there is no general account of what acceptability is, but it is that's a task that has to be tackled easily. So, for certain domains, you have to show how acceptability from that domain doesn't involve any inflationary concept of truth. I think it can be done. I'm most interested in the case of, for example, epistemic justification. I can exemplify with that. The idea would be that whether it is a sentence like believing that phi is justified is true relative to is acceptable given a certain epistemic norm. It's just to say that given epistemic norm, that what's in that sentence? Let me start. And the idea would be this: epistemic norms may be thought of as policies that tell you what to believe and what not to believe, or what beliefs to form and what beliefs not to form. And in a sense, they are closely related to a procedure for forming beliefs. So what you actually have to show in order to show that acceptability relative to the epistemic norm is the personality itself, is to show that the procedure for forming beliefs doesn't rely on any conception of inflationary truth. So, for example, you could have something like you believe a certain perceptual proposition only have a relevant perceptual experience. And you would have to provide an account of how that entitles you to have that belief. That would be the